How awesome was that? How impossible is that to follow, guys? So I'm going to invite up Estelle MacDonald from Hull in the UK, Saleem Tariq from Leeds in the UK, Paul Nixon from New Zealand, Mary Ivec from Australia, and Leigh Goodmark from the United States. We need a few more chairs. We just need a couple more chairs. We have 3 chairs, so we need a couple more chairs. Yep. So I did consult with them before I'm about to do this, which is to say I'm not actually going to introduce them to you. I'm not going to tell you who they are because I think it's more important that we give them some time to show you who they are by what they have to share. Their bios are online. And in the program, you'll see the areas that we've asked them to talk about. In part, the ask made of each of them, and I'll moderate the panel, was to tell us a bit about the difference that it makes when you think relationally about the world to the work and the places and spaces in which they live and work and make a difference. And so we've asked Estelle in particular to talk to us about her work and experience in educations and in building schools and connection to community. We've asked Sal to talk about community along the theme of community and leadership, but mostly in terms of organizational and change leadership. Mary's going to address thinking about the environment through this lens, through a relational lens, and Leigh's going to talk to us about interpersonal and interpartner violence through this lens. I've asked them each to say a few things to give us a frame, and then for me to give you an opportunity to pick up on the threads, because there'll be so much intersection as there is in their work. The other thing to say to you is they have all in various ways been connected to supporting one another's learning and participating in this kind of larger community we're all a part of that's trying to work restoratively. So I'm going to turn it over. Do you want to go in that order? Do you want to kind of go from this side to this side, and then I'll intervene, either to ask you a question or just let you talk to each other? Okay.
Can you people hear me? Yeah, okay. My name's Estelle MacDonald. I am a head teacher by trade. I am also a CEO of a large academy trust. I live in Hull and I work in Hull. Hull is a city in the UK at the wrong end of the league tables for everything, for outcomes for children and young people. So those disadvantages, are very significant in Hull and significant on our outcomes. So I'm going to start with why I do what I do. I'm a head teacher and now a CEO because I believe, like I'm sure you all do, that children, all children, wherever they're from, deserve the very best chance and the very best education to achieve and overcome what they need to be rounded and competent and real citizens in the world and in their communities. I took on a school that was failing as a head teacher in a very mixed community, very broken community, and worked very hard with that community in a relational way to transform that school together from being a failing school to being an outstanding school. It's still an outstanding school now. I went on to form with my colleagues an academy trust, which is now a group of 14 schools in Hull that all work collaboratively, and our only requirement if you want to join us as a school is that you work in a relational and a restorative way. We've attracted a lot of attention both in Hull and in the country, and actually worldwide now with our restorative work, because we are very successful in terms of outcomes for children. So while the city is in the bottom 10% of outcomes in our country, our Academy Trust is in the top 10%. within that city. And we feel are very proud of what we achieve and continue to achieve. What's important to us is that we provide the very best education, but prepare those young people for this global world. And so we feel that what we do is fundamentally changing children and families' attitudes and aspirations in a city that is very challenging. As I'm standing here now, we've left colleagues back in Hull entertaining, I'll say very loosely, HMI, our Ofsted inspectors, who are knocking on the door and asking us why we are so successful. We entertain a lot of international visitors, show them what we do, but most importantly are getting that message out there that the foundation of our success and the success of our young people is down to our restorative and relational practice. It permeates everything we do. It is our culture. If you want to come and work for us, you have to buy into that in every sense and be part of that and add to that. And that's very exciting for us. So I hope I've just whetted your appetite, because we are doing some workshops this week. My colleagues from Hull are here to give you more of the what and the how, but I just wanted to share with you why, and to say how transformational working in this way has been, not just for the children and families in Hull, but for us as leaders and practitioners too. Thank you.
Give us a wave at the back. A wave at the back? Okay, so you can hear me, yeah, okay. Hi, thank you very much for inviting us here. It's a great honour and privilege to be speaking to you. My name's Saleem Tariq, and I'm Deputy Director of Children's Services in a city called Leeds in the UK, which is about an hour west, I think. Yeah, an hour west from where Hull is, and we have communities in Leeds that live in quite deprived neighbourhoods, some matching that level of deprivation that Estelle talked about in Hull, but also as a city we have quite large areas of wealth which balances out overall the deprivation that we see as a city, but there are enormous challenges in working in that environment. I'm from a child welfare background, so I qualified as a social worker about 24 years ago, and I've worked for Leeds City Council ever since. I'm not an elected official. I'm a local government employee, therefore I'm not allowed to talk politics. I have to be politically neutral, but I really enjoyed the input that we had this morning, and I think some of the work that we're going to be talking about here at the conference in terms of the Leeds story really relates to that issue about the separation of children from their families. And whilst this might not be in that same context that Mr. Donovan talked about this morning, it is in the context of a relationship between the state and citizens of our jurisdictions. And my contention is that we are removing far too many children from their families through state processes, and not supporting and helping families effectively enough to maintain children within their own family and community networks. So some of the work that we've done in analysing what happens for families in Leeds has pointed us to the fact that we think around 10% of the children that come to the attention of child welfare agencies suffer really serious harm, so sexual abuse, broken bones in children, serious physical violence, but 90% of the children and families that we come across are struggling in conditions of adversity, so struggling with substance misuse issues, domestic violence, adult mental health issues. And what we have is a system that deals with that 100% from the 10% angle. Actually, in terms of the 10%, we're probably pretty good at identifying and responding to those children and their needs, because they happen in quite serious circumstances. We work effectively together as agencies and respond. But in the 90%, I think we are struggling internationally to engage and connect with those families in order to make a significant difference to their outcomes. And I'm quite concerned at the moment about how much certainly the social work profession, but the child welfare generally, has got itself caught up in process as opposed to relationships. And one example of that is how people talk quite a lot about them undertaking assessments. So the focus of what work they're doing becomes the assessment, not the relationship that they are supposed to be building, because that relationship that they build engenders trust. And in those circumstances, what we can do is to support families and children to create change. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And much of the work that we've done over the last 5 or 10 years has been trying to drive us back into that space of building strong relationships with families and communities in order to support them to change and improve their outcomes in their lives. We've used a strong restorative approach both to the culture and leadership within the organisation, so we'll talk quite a bit about that over the coming days. But underlying that, I think, is something about getting back to being much more human in our response to the families that we come across and that we work with, because we've laid our relationship with them through these processes that we've created, thinking that those processes are keeping children safe when they're not. It is the relationships that we build that will keep children safe, and we've really used restorative practice as a vehicle to help us get back into that humane approach to working with vulnerable children and their families. And we've seen a growing relationship with the communities that we serve. We've seen more positive engagement from those families in terms of what we are doing and their participation that people have talked about them telling us about their experience of the services that we offer and how we might make them better. And we've started to see significant changes in patterns. So the numbers of children in care, for example, as one indicator, has significantly reduced in Leeds at a time when nationally those numbers have been significantly increasing. So hope to share some of that with you and to learn from you over the coming days. Thank you very much.
Kei te mihi ki tēnei whenua, ko Burlington, Vermont, tēnā koutou. Kei te mihi abnaki tangata, nā mihi nui, tēnā koutou. Kei te mihi kina, manuhiri maha, tēnā koutou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, and kia ora mai tātou. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi Māori e, tātou e. Kia ora. So greetings all. Thank you, Rogi, for singing with me. She's my sister, so she helps out whenever she can. Really delighted and privileged to be here. My name is Paul Nixon. I'm a social worker. I've been a social worker for 28 years. I'm currently the Chief Social Worker for Oranga Tamariki, which is the New Zealand government's service for youth justice, care and protection, and children who are vulnerable in New Zealand. So I'm a dad. I've got 3 children. The eldest is Caris. She's now 20. And Caris is a Welsh name, and it means beloved. And she went on an OE a couple of years ago, went to London and met a Mexican student, and she fell in love with him. So she came back to Wellington because she was due to go to university in Auckland, and she said, "Dad, I need to go to Mexico. I'm in love with Iñaki." So I said, "Well, you better go then. If you're in love, you better go." So she bought a one-way ticket and flew to Mexico, and she's still there now. Really happy and doing well at university. She won a scholarship to study there. My youngest is Rihanna. It's a Welsh name too. It means moon princess. And the middle one, she's 16. The middle one is Hayden. He's 18 years old. And Hayden means he who dwells in a hedge, which is a perfect name for Hayden. And kids have this habit of keeping you in order as parents. And my partner, Nikki's a child protection social worker, and I've been one for years. So must be some concerns about the long-term psychological well-being of the children living in that environment. And Karis, when she was little, once said to Nikki, "Mum, what does Dad do at work?" And Nick thought and said, "Well, he tries to help mummies and daddies who are looking after children, who are having problems looking after children." So Karis said, "Do you mean like you, Mum?" Which is brilliant. Kids are brilliant at speaking the truth. So I want to talk about 4 things briefly, just to open up some ideas for you. The first is about Indigenous leadership. What's striking about Māori is they'll tell you the 2 most important things is look after the land and look after people, look after relationships, and of course they're right, and those 2 things are connected, as Jennifer talked about this morning. How do we create law and policy that are shaped by tangata whenua, by Indigenous folk who understand their needs fundamentally and their patterns and traditions of living? Well, you have to find leaders in your Indigenous community, find leaders and try and clear the path and way for them, giving them authority to change patterns of engagement with Indigenous folk. Big challenge for government is how they do that. How does government change? How do agencies change? So they're not institutionally racist, so they can meet the needs of our Indigenous folk in ways that really have authenticity and meaning to those people. For me, that meant finding 2 Indigenous leaders, Llewellyn Rufio and Moana Erawira. Leland was a PhD Māori social worker, Moana too. And I said to them, I need to develop a practice approach for Māori, and can you do that can you give us a framework in like 3 months or so? And they said, absolutely not, no way. I said, well, how long do you need to do that? He said, well, at least 2 years. And they set about using an Indigenous approach to building an understanding of a practice framework built on what Indigenous practitioners were doing, consulting with iwi, the tribes, people outside the organization, people close to the community, as well as practitioners in the community who are finding innovative ways of working in more culturally responsive models. And they produced a framework for our practice, which is driven by 8 key principles. I don't have time to talk about those here right now, but I'm doing a workshop tomorrow on this. I'm just going to share with you 4 quickly. Tikanga. Tikanga is protocols of engagement, of how we engage together, and doing that in a way that's right for Māori rather than right for government. Te reo, the language, Māori language, which represents a worldview. So when you come to New Zealand, you learn the language because it's tikanga to open a meeting with a greeting in Māori and a waiata, a song in Māori. But it's really the meaning of the words that they teach, and it's the meaning of the words that tell you everything about a Māori worldview. Rangatiratanga, which is self-governance and leadership. Māori people leading their decisions, leading their future, leading their outcomes. Whakapapa. Whakapapa is all your relationships and connections. And wairoatanga. Wai means water. Roa is two waters. So wairoatanga is about spirituality, the visible world or the visible water that you can see, and then the second water, which you can't see but you can feel and you can sense. So these are principles governing the way we construct our practice with Indigenous folk that change the pattern of engagement based on Indigenous ideas and Indigenous practices, and they apply to all children and all families that we work with in New Zealand. The second key message for me is about implementation. We do 10,000 family group conferences annually in New Zealand, 5,000 youth justice conferences, 5,000 care and protection conferences in our law. And how do you keep developing your practice in a way that holds the fidelity and the integrity of the initial intention behind this practice? Particularly when you're asked to deliver conferences on sort of industrial levels and save costs at the same time, which is a problem around governments around the world. You get people cutting corners, thinking ways of cost saving, but actually only sort of spoils the process and the engagement of people and damages confidence. So how we hold on to the integrity and fidelity of our thinking, our principles, our practices is a real challenge when you when you introduce a practice across the nation. And also the second point on implementation is de-implementation. What do we have to deconstruct or stop doing or stop thinking that enable us to work in different ways and create different patterns with people so that they're more effective and they're more engaged? Third key point, children's voices. I mean, you heard the kids sing just now, and you heard how it affected and changed your mood and the atmosphere in the room. That's what happens when you engage children. They make you think and work differently, usually because they're smarter than us and they ask us smart questions. Do adults necessarily know better than children? Particularly when, or perhaps especially when, they won't be the consumers of whatever decision is made for them. If professionals are making decisions about children, will they have to live with that decision? The child certainly does. Our anxieties about involving children in decision-making probably say more about our anxieties as adults than the capabilities of children to be involved in decision-making. Seems to me that children can challenge our orthodox ways of doing things and thinking things if we really position them to have a voice. One of the things we started to do is involving children in the appointment of staff, which is brilliant, of course, because kids are very good at sussing out adults and what their motivations are, but also it signals something very strong to the applicant, that children are important in what they think about you as someone to work for this organization. And I think we should be moving to give children the vote. Wouldn't it change the pattern of things if we gave children the vote? Imagine 12-year-olds up being allowed to vote. What would happen to the pattern of our politics in our country? We'd probably see a more humane, a more connected, and certainly a more fun society to live in. In fact, my daughter Rihanna, who's the youngest, says children should have 2 votes because they've got a bigger investment in the future than the old folk. She's only joking, she didn't mean that really, but I thought it was quite funny. Okay, the final point, innovation. Don't get too fixed on a model. And Jennifer's talked about this morning. Don't get too fixed on a model. Think more about the principles that drive your behavior and your thinking, your engagement, and the practice. It's the principles. With our Indigenous framework, it's called Titoko Tumoana, and Titoko Tumoana is the rock in the ocean. So as the ocean moves and the sea shifts, there's still this rock, which is a navigational rock, which keeps you true, like a North Star, keeps you true to the way you should go. So use your rock in the ocean, or use your North Star to guide your work. Stick to your values, stick to your principles, and you'll definitely do the right thing. I'm really interested in conversations over the next few days about how we innovate. How do we innovate in these practices so we don't get stuck in models or simple processes, but we're constantly testing ourselves and asking ourselves, how could this be more restorative? How could it be more empowering? How could it give more power to the people who should be taking it, which is children, families, communities? So I think that's a question for us to keep challenging and thinking about. One of the things we found in New Zealand is the creation of a hui whānau approach, which is a family meeting approach, which operates at any time when you need to solve a problem or make a decision. Just get a family together and they'll start to work together to make plans for the future. Kia ora. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organising committee for the invitation to be back in Burlington. I feel really fortunate on this second trip to Burlington that I have with me from Canberra dear friends and colleagues, Fiona, Holly, who I couldn't have done any of this without you. When I came in 2014, it was on my own, having been to Halifax in 2011. And I just have to say very publicly thank you to Fiona and Holly for being part of this amazing journey that we as Canberra are on, but also as individuals and collectively. We also have Tony from Canberra and Nicola from Newcastle, and I'm just so thrilled that Canberra is now being joined with Newcastle to explore this idea of a restorative community. So I have to actually send my greetings. I feel a bit of a fraud here because I think that my colleagues back in Canberra should be here talking about their work on restorative environment and restorative justice in environment. So John Braithwaite, Miranda Forsyth, Valerie Braithwaite, Deb Cleland, dear colleagues at RegNet, and they weren't able to be here, but they are about to launch on a very exciting 3-year project, having been successful for an Australian Research Council grant to explore how to prevent and address environmental harm through restorative justice. And that's with the regulator in Victoria, the Victorian Environmental Protection Agency, as the industry partner. So the Victorian EPA was actually established in 1971, and it was the first environmental regulator in Australia and the second in the world. So I guess part of my role here today is to help build connections between the work that Miranda, John, Val and Deb will be doing with the Victorian Environmental Protection Agency, with the Vermont Law School and with all of you as part of the international restorative justice community. You might be thinking, well, I'm not an environment person, but you are restorative justice people. And so really, I think as Jen presented to us this morning, this idea that a restorative approach is a relational approach which requires us to think about our interpersonal relations and how our relationships are structured, supported and governed, nestled in the environment in which we live. So I guess I'd like to invite you to think about very intentionally about your own environment, about our environment, the fact that our very lives are inextricably linked to and dependent upon the well-being of this planet, to this land, air, water, and all things living therein. My own grappling with this idea, Jen's sort of challenge and to us to think about a relational approach and a relational analysis in the context of environment is really framed somewhat very slowly for me through my PhD studies examining a relational and multi-level governance of chemicals in Australia. Now, this is really odd for me because my background's actually in social work and I've been a social worker for almost 30 years. And my particular passion has actually been and still is the ongoing removal of Aboriginal children from their mothers, families, communities and land. So in 2011, when I first came to Halifax for an International Learning Community conference, I decided to do something different, and I thought, there's someone presenting on restorative approaches in the environment. I thought, I know nothing about the environment. I thought, I think I should go to this workshop. And there was a fellow there by the name of Michael Jones, and he was a Canadian fisheries officer and he retired in 2015, but he had been a fisheries officer for 32 years. And for the previous 5 years before his retirement, he was the restorative justice coordinator of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And I thought this was really interesting. I found this really very exciting. And it's sort of weird because I think here I am working with people like John Braithwaite, and I think I'm going across to the other side of the world to work out how people are doing this. Because I think we feel a lot that we have actually lost our way somewhat in Australia, despite having wonderful people around us like John and Val. So we really actually do feel sometimes like we are the end of the universe and the end of the world. And so having this international community is very important to us. Anyway, Michael shared some of his work at that workshop back in 2011, and he talked about how in the Pacific, the Department of Fisheries, or DFO, had been using restorative justice since 2001. And he said he'd been to dozens of restorative justice conferences, international and otherwise, and he had never seen a presentation from an environmental enforcement agency. So he thought he'd come and talk a little bit about his work. And then he proceeded to tell the story of how in 2007 there had been the death of a sturgeon fish that had occurred as a result of the extension of a power station, and how, despite the fact that the department had the evidence to take this to court, they decided on a restorative approach. And so it was very much a profoundly moving moment for me as I was starting to think how Michael described working with First Nations people, working with First Nations communities, and saying that with them using justice processes, practices and traditions that really helped them as a department to address that harm that had been done through the death of the sturgeon fish. But what Michael was saying was that the huge issue, of course, was the legacy of distrust that had happened over centuries with Indigenous. And things started coming to my mind about, well, this is just very much like it is back home, the legacy of distrust with our Indigenous people through residential schools and through constant and removal of children, and that Michael again was stressing the need to rebuild trust that had been lost between the communities and the work that he was doing. And so some of these themes were sort of bubbling up in me and thinking, well, how do we become generators of trust? And one of John's PhD students recently said to me, you know, John Braithwaite is just he's a walking generator of trust. And I thought, in terms of our restorative work, our challenge is always to be building trust and to be building connection. And so where I'm really going with this is that part of my family's enjoyment is camping and visiting national parks, and we have actually some really beautiful national parks and some lovely beaches, so please come and enjoy those with us. But what I could see was that there were incredible opportunities in how our Aboriginal communities worked with government in some of the management of state national parks and land management, and there were obviously models that were happening in land care where the state was working quite well with our Aboriginal communities. And I'm thinking, well, why can't we translate that? Why can't we look at why can the state enable this sort of relationship, but yet we're saying that Aboriginal families can't look after their children? And so this care of the land and care of children, I think, is quite closely linked and connected, and we do need to explore, I think, in the way Jen has challenged us to do, to think about our problems differently, to really mould a different future, and to look at some of these situations that are happening, these case studies, as hope in situ, as Val Braithwaite talks about, building institutions of hope rather than what at the moment is, certainly in Australia, in terms of our environment, how we're looking after our environment. The work that Miranda and John will be leading over the next 3 years is something that hopefully they'll be here at the next conference telling you about. But we just really wanted to flag with you the fact that that much of this work and our thinking has been influenced by being part of this community. So thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all.
So good morning, everyone. Oh, that's a good surly Northeastern crowd. Nobody says good morning. I feel so at home now. Thank you all so much for that. I want to say thank you to my wonderful friends in the restorative justice community for allowing me to be here. I'm a complete and total interloper, as you'll hear in just a moment. And while everyone else is sharing with you their stories of success, I want to tell you a story about failure, mine, and then success. So Jennifer talked about relational challenges this morning, and in perhaps no context are those challenges greater than in the context of intimate partner violence. The most intense relationships, the most destroyed relationships, the most need for repair, and the most kind of danger inherent in that repair in some really important ways. I come to this work as a lawyer with about 25 years of experience representing people who've been subjected to harm. There is no murmuring now, but she looks so young. How is that possible? And I am a bit of a fraud at this conference, although I believe passionately in the use of restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence, and I have been thinking and writing about these issues for years, I have yet to make this happen in my community. So I was here 4 years ago, and I talked to you then about how much I believed in this, and we had lots of conversations, and we had lots of momentum, and it all went nowhere. And that's my failure. Now, I am now a trained restorative facilitator, and we are again having this conversation about how we could do this work in my own community in Baltimore, but I think this is not unusual in the context of intimate partner violence. While the work is happening in pockets around the country, it's probably the most underdeveloped area of the work really across the board. And I think that's in part because we recognize that restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence is in some ways the third rail of restorative justice. It's the thing that Howard Zehr said, maybe it's a bad idea to do it in this context, right? So we've been from the start looking at this as possibly the outlier or the place where restorative practices won't work. And we know that if we try this, and it fails, those who believe that this is a terrible, destructive idea, some from within my own intimate partner violence community and advocacy community, and some from the forces that run our criminal legal system, will not give us another chance. And so we're skittish about getting this work done. A few years ago, I published a book that suggested that restorative justice could be used to address intimate partner violence, and several months after that book came out, a woman in my community called me, and she told me that she had read my work and asked if I could help her start a restorative process with her husband, who had been arrested for abusing her. She was not interested in using the criminal legal system. She had called the police just to interrupt the violence, but for nothing else. And this was not the way that she wanted to see this go. And ruefully, I said to her, I can't. We don't have that. We don't offer that in our community. There's nowhere I can send you. No such services existed in Baltimore at that time. And we talked for a while that day, and we kept in touch over the ensuing years, and she'd email me from time to time to tell me how she was. She began to explore restorative justice and the concept of forgiveness on her own, and she had always hoped that she would be able to use some kind of restorative practice, even in the years after, to develop a different relationship with her husband, her ex-husband, who had long since moved away. The case went through the legal system, it went through the criminal system, it went through the protective order system, and it went through a divorce. And while all of those outcomes for her were good in the way that advocacy has traditionally defined good, he was punished, she got an order, we achieved separation between these people, none of them gave her what she needed. Until recently. And I'm going to read to you the email that she sent me recently with her permission. I asked her if I could share it with all of you. And what she says is this: Last month, I heard from my kid's dad's lawyer that he needed my consent to shield the protective order record that was from the order that had been entered 3 years ago. I was willing to give my consent. I went to court on the day and saw his lawyer in the courtroom. I told the lawyer that my husband has not been my enemy. I am there for him, and he can tell me what he needs. His lawyer was quite appreciative, shocking, and suggested I could say something if I wished at the time of giving consent because her husband would be appearing telephonically. Like I said, he had moved away. So when I had to give consent, the judge asked if I had any questions. I said I would like to read something if I had her permission. She permitted, and I read the following I had taken with me. I filed for the protective order after the incident and based on police advice. I had felt quite scared at the time. I forgave the act unconditionally. I have never doubted as a person his core qualities are of compassion, generosity, love, gratitude, and forgiveness as of anyone. I would be willing to give consent and restore part of what is broken. I need his help. Would he be willing to help me in building peace? I could not help it. I was almost in tears saying this. The judge asked her husband if he would be willing to help me in building peace. He said yes. I did it most for myself. It felt restorative, and I think it is helping me heal. I know I cannot ask him for peace. It begins with me. But my hope is that this will guide the intentions and the interactions between him and me, and that may be this starts to shift the conflict situation. I remember your words about empathy when we talked. I think being able to connect with him at the level of feelings and needs helped resolve this. So here's what's amazing to me about this email. Without formal training, without the intervention of restorative practitioners, this woman instinctively asked the 3 basic questions that we ask in the context of restorative justice. What was the harm? How did it affect her? And what was it that she needed to address that harm? She knew what she needed. She created a process on her own to get it. And she did that in a system that is notoriously not open to allowing for such things. And Bobby, this really reminds me of the story that you told here 4 years ago as a prosecutor. And I don't remember if you told it to them or you just told it to me. I think you told it to them. But about trying to create spaces within a system that is not set up to give victims the things that they need for them to get those things that they need. As a result of having been able to do that, she is healing in a different way than she was healing before, in a much more powerful to her way, in a much more important to her way. A protective order didn't give her that. A criminal prosecution didn't give her that. Having her husband say that he would help to give her peace after everything that they had been through, that's what gave her healing. That's the success part of this story. But she shouldn't have had to create that process on her own ad hoc. She shouldn't have had to ask his lawyer's permission to be able to do it, and she surely shouldn't have had to ask a judge to be able to do it, and she was really lucky that she got a judge who was willing to hear her out and create the space within which she could do that. And she didn't get to do it in the context of community. She was deprived of those relational elements, that restorative community that Jennifer talked about this morning. And that's, I think, where our work has to be. Around the issue of intimate partner violence, it's helping our community, the small advocacy community, the bigger community that's made up of the professionals that staff the criminal legal system, our geographic communities, our religious communities, our ethnic communities, our social communities, understand why this is a good process in the context of intimate partner violence. Our anxieties about this, as Paul said, say much more about us than they do about the capacities or the needs of the people about whom we are talking. And people like this woman are the reason why we need restorative justice in the context of intimate partner violence. I look forward to working with all of you to figure out how we can make that happen.
So I'm struck across what we've heard in that moment, Leigh, as you said, the question she asked was, will you help me build peace? In part because the way I come at this work is from the international peace building work in terms of what happens in societies when things go terribly wrong and are broken, and we have to think about rebuilding. And what happens in those moments is all of our systems that we throw at that to keep people apart, to prosecute people, to find the bad people, to put them away, to figure out who has to go to the International Court of Justice to be blamed for what happened, to sanctions, to do not help people who continue to be on the ground asking that question of each other. How will you help us reach out? And it strikes me that in all of what you've said and in all of what I know of the work that you do, that those core questions that people have of one another, that people have within those communities, and that people have of systems are those questions. In schools, will you help me make it right? That you know are the same conversations that are happening when they go home or when they go to play, that are happening for your staff and systems, that are happening across the city of Leeds, as you want them to be saying, how can we reach out in child welfare, in the environment, and in our caretaking, and in our interpersonal relationships. And so I'm struck by how common that work is actually, in terms of what the work is to have us be able to be well, and then how little our systems are structured to do that. And you've all spoken about different systems of education, systems of structural, organizational systems, systems of child welfare, systems of the way in which we manage land, right? We manage those, and the systems of the ways in which we manage people's relationships. So I just wonder if you had anything you wanted to add, having heard one another, having chimed in to make those connections, or if you prefer to kind of turn it over knowing that there may be a couple of questions around that sort of overarching connecting theme, and then many opportunities as we open up into the space where we're going to be talking to one another, both in the workshops you'll hold and the workshops that we know are being offered by people here in Vermont and from elsewhere where you've all traveled to come and have those conversations. So we don't want to preempt all of that conversation, but any quick comments from here, and then I'll open it up. They want to hear from you. You can see those. All right. So do you have any comments as we start? Any questions that you want either us all to hold as we move forward, or that you'd like to begin our talking and thinking about? And there is a handheld mic, so you actually pop up out of your seat at least briefly to sort of wave at someone, so we know you'd like to speak.
And I'm at the University of Vermont. My question is the struggle that we're in with the systems of either white supremacy, patriarchy, et cetera. So we're trying to work within a system that perpetuates oppression. And the question is, we're in a container, and as Jamie Washington, who's a phenomenal social justice trainer in the United States, says, we're in a container, and as much as we scramble stuff in here, if we're still in that container. So that's sort of something that I would love to maybe struggle through and have more conversation about.
Right, and that happens for practitioners all the way up to systems, right? In terms of practitioners, the answer is, how can you restore in a broken world? Go fix the world first, then restore. How do we do that? Do you have?
So I don't think we can do it on our own. For me, it's thinking about what are our patterns and protocols of engagement with people who need to have voice and need to exercise leadership, and how do we position decision-making in a way that our most disenfranchised groups or unheard groups can speak and guide and lead. A little story from me in terms of Maori leadership. We tried advertising for Maori leaders in the traditional government way and completely failed to get anyone who was really interested. So I had to start to speak to Maori leaders inside the organisation about who could possibly take that leadership role, and they guided me to this chap called Llewellyn Rufus, and I had to hop on the plane up to Tauranga and meet him in a car park and sit down with him and have fish and chips with him on the beach and spend the whole evening with him. And that just gave him a chance to build some trust and understanding of what we were trying to do in government. And then through that process, he was willing to step forward and do an application, and he came to the organisation. At the same time, someone else, through again a network of Māori people inside the organisation, said, you need to speak to Moana Irawara, and Moana stepped forward, and then we put the two together, and then we tried to clear the space for them so that they could lead, and lead in a way that reflected their needs of their people, of their way of doing things, of their patterns of engagement, which meant the organisation had to stop what it was doing, demanding a policy in 5 minutes, and readjust itself to think about how it had to be different. And through that process, what we've seen is the voices of our Māori people, both inside child protection, youth justice services, but also outside, get stronger. And one of the interesting indicators of that was we got increasing numbers of Māori people coming forward to work in the organisation. So 30% of the organisation now is Māori. And realising that there would be a voice and there would be a model of working and a way of working that reflected what they understood as right for their people. So that's a huge challenge for the organisation to rethink itself and to stop and to step back and to recast its relationship, really. And then once that happened, the iwis, the tribes around the country, were more interested in working with government because they saw Māori people inside the government organisation, right? So it's a huge question you're asking us, but I think that you've got to find the leaders in those groups and give them voice and create space and clear the way for them so that they can lead. And inevitably, the bureaucracy creeps back, right? Inevitably, the bureaucracy tries to regain some control, and there's a constant struggle around that pattern of engagement and decision-making, which is active all the time, and you find ways of reinforcing your leaders and strengthening your leaders and strengthening your people. And I think the same is true with children. You see these initiatives to involve children and give them voice and to find a space for them to lead. And then people start to say, we can't do that, it's not the right thing, we're not getting the results we want to see as quickly and fast as we want to see them. And yet, when you do that, you do build confidence and voice in young people, and people start to rethink what their relationship is with children and how they work with children. So I was completely serious when I was talking about giving children the vote. I think that would change the pattern. And I think if you shift decision-making and create patterns of engagement, then that will happen. So we can't do it. And in fact, government organisations constantly claw back to the orthodoxy and claw back to what they know, a sort of conservative, defensive, risk-averse position. And you've got to keep challenging and working on that outside the organisation, inside the organisation, but find your leaders to help you create that change.
My area really is the criminal legal system, and one of the things I actually worry about the most in the context of restorative justice is that we will tinker around the edges of the criminal legal system, say we've done something transformative, and drag with us all of the racism and patriarchy and structural oppression that exists in that system into our practices. That terrifies me. And in the US, it's complicated maybe in the same way and maybe in a different way, in that I live in a community that is largely a community of color, where many of the people in power are people of color. And so just increasing representation doesn't necessarily undermine those structures of racism and oppression that continue to exist. I mean, Baltimore City, if you look at the cops who arrested Freddie Gray, a local reference for some of you, I realize, but I know it was around the world. Some of those cops were black cops. So there's it's so much more complicated for us in that way. And I think that part of that, and this is something I've learned a lot about from people like Karen Transgard-Scott, who's going to do a session this afternoon, is about our consistently interrogating these issues particularly and pulling them out and making them painful and saying, where is the racism here? Where is the structural oppression here? Where is the economic oppression here? Where is the patriarchy here? Are we perpetuating these things in our practices? And how do we stop? And that, I think, has got to be part of this work on a daily and minute-by-minute basis, or you're absolutely right. We call something something different, but it's the exact same set of problems. And to the extent that we see restorative justice as separate, I think Jen really crystallized it for me this morning in saying oppression is relational. Racism is relational. It is about one person's relation to another person and certain groups' relations to other people. So those have to be key kind of motivators of our work as well. And how we do that, I think, is by that minute, really searching, difficult, horrible and painful conversations and having the kinds of relationships with people who are doing the work that enable us to have those conversations about the things that we're doing.
Let's answer that another way. There's just one more point I wanted to make about, we talked about culture and practice, and I want to say about the law. So in New Zealand, what was created in 1989 was a law which enabled and gave entitlements to families to make decisions before the state could apply to the court or make decisions before the state could intervene. And in doing that, positioned families as the first decision makers for children legally. So that's why we have 10,000 conferences a year. When the Act was introduced, the numbers of children in state care halved and then continued to go down. And the numbers of children in custody went half as well and continued to go down. In fact, New Zealand has one of the lowest populations of children in youth custody in the whole world. It has one of the highest populations of adult custody in the whole world, and that's because of the law and how it's applied and how it's used. And it's families that have made that difference, not the state. It's families that have made that difference by taking the decision making.
And surely part of that challenge as we're going into these sessions to think about, there's a legal scholar named Roberto Unger who depressingly says there's no great revolutions left. He's disenchanted that he missed his chance to be part of the revolution in his home country, I think. And his theory was there's no great revolutions left because systems have become so good at keeping those who would bring change busy at the margins. So this goes to your point, Leigh, that we will all tinker at the margins and then not actually bring what we're learning at the margins. We do really risk not only busying ourselves with tinkering at the margins and not asking those bigger questions, but worse than that, we may actually be reinforcing systems when all we do is focus at a practice level, and we use those practices without interrogating the goals of the current system to get where the current system is going, right? And so if it's about better behavior and compliance in schools rather than really changing the experience of family and children and what they can learn and how they learn, if it's about better compliance of employees because you make them, sit in a circle and get along, but you don't actually let them question what it is that's structuring the relationships. If we're overlaying these practices in a way that doesn't have any feedback loop to how the place is actually working to those systemic issues in the justice system, in child welfare, and then we do risk being not only not revolutionary, part of reinforcing the status quo, I think.
We do have one more question in the back here.
Thank you for the opportunity. To the esteemed panelists, I'm excited for all that you have to share with all of us in terms of being restorative justice practitioners. But you just said something about reinforcing the system, and I'm wondering about what's happening right here in the room. Earlier, the gentleman, I think from New Zealand, talked about the importance of inclusion of young people. I know there's a young woman from Bates in Maine College that's here who's doing restorative justice work, but they're not on the panel. And I'm concerned that if this is the future, for 2 votes versus 1 vote, that we need to find ways to be contextual. You also suggested that in our country right now, young people are taking up the cross from Parkland to the Black Lives Matter movement, but we're not finding ways to engage them. So I'm wondering, as panelists, what are your thoughts about the lack of youth, young people on the panel, and their perspective to move us forward perhaps a little bit faster than as those of us who may be a little older are able to actually do?
Great question.
So I think that is a great question, not only in terms of this panel, but how we structure gatherings like this, where the places and spaces in which we can create opportunities to gather together. We're going to try to do that, I think, in a variety of ways over the next 3 days. We're also going to hope that we only have these momentary, these types of gatherings at moments, but that we are gathering in different ways in community. I think it's a great question in terms of how it is that we challenge ourselves about the ways in which we can be together, talk together, create space. I'm all for shaking up conferences, panel or no, but why don't we see if Sal has an explanation for his aged nature.
As you'll be able to see, I'm quite youthful, really, in looks and my outlook. I can't answer for why there are no young people here on the panel. I think I can talk a little bit about some of the attempts that we've made to really put children and young people at the heart of what we are trying to achieve. And in Leeds, we were on a journey of improvement in terms of our child welfare services between 2009, which is continuing. But at a certain point, we had to ask ourselves whether what we were doing was fixing systems and processes and procedures. I think this links a little bit to the previous question. Is that what our ambition was going to be, to fix those processes and procedures and systems that have been broken, or was our ambition going to be much greater than that? And we decided that our ambition would be much greater than that, and we decided to build a narrative around children and economic growth in a particular area. So I talked a little bit about Leeds in my opening gambit. There's a lot of physical regeneration of the place taking place, so that the city is starting to look better. Financially, there's a lot of investment in it. It's the legal centre of the north of England. There's a lot of things going for the city. What we decided to do was to try and tie that to children and young people and our ambitions and aspiration for them within the city, and created this idea about trying to make Leeds a child-friendly city, explicitly with the idea that if in this generation we disproportionately invest in children and young people, then in the next generation, as the city grows and physically regenerates, you are also creating a social regeneration. And that actually we are investing in children and young people in order that they have the skills, attributes, loyalty to the place to be able to make the most of that physical regeneration that's taking place.
Just wanted to say a couple of things on that, because obviously working in schools, children are our absolute core business, and we've worked very hard on voice and influence of children being not just tokenistic, but really part of the growth of our organisation. And actually, when we get back to Hull next week, I think it's on Wednesday, we have a children's conference that is totally run by children. Some adults have helped them, but they have put the conference together, and it's about what's good about our organisation and their schools and Hull. And the things they're going to celebrate are the things they think they are really good at and that other children can learn from. So, I think it's absolutely crucial that children lead the way. They're much more intelligent than us, and they're much more in tune with basic needs and the way we should go forward. I just wanted to say something else about, some people have heard this story from me before, but speaking to the idea of community and involving community and creating spaces for the community to make decisions. A couple of years ago, we had a very tragic accident at the school that actually I am executive head of, as well as being head of the organisation. And a child and their mother were killed on the way to picking the other children up from school. And of course, it massively affected the community. And yes, there were some legal things that we had to go through in terms of child death review and so on. But what we did as a community was we opened up the school as a space for all the community to come and share their feelings about what had happened. And that actually went wider to my colleagues and leaders from schools wider than our immediate geographical community came and supported the school in its tragic, moment. But what happened was really interesting, because all I did really was create some space for the community to come. And the school is part of a very diverse community, so we have over 38 different languages. And you know what? The children in the school, there aren't any, I'm not saying there aren't any problems, but they get on, they understand about equality, they work together very effectively. The problems are with the adults. But that on that day that we opened the school to the community, all those people came because of a shared disaster, if you like, that they wanted to respond to in some sort of positive way and find some peace and some restoration. So for the first time, in my experience of being a leader in that school, those Saudi Arabian fathers who refused to speak to me because I'm a woman, they come and say, can I speak to the head teacher? And I say, it's me. They go, no, the male head teacher. No, I am the head teacher. But they stood alongside and wept with those white working class mothers in my school and shared a connection and an intention to make things better. People came in with phones, translating messages that they could write for the family in the book, and so on. And it was absolutely a profound experience in terms of community and connection. You can see it still affects me now. But what I'm trying to say is, as leaders, sometimes we just need to create the space for other people to do the work.
Jen, can I just very, very quickly say, so I'm not sure that we've been directly responsive to the question, though. So here's something directly responsive, I think, to the question. People ask me to come talk, and I come talk because it's fun, and I like to do it, and I enjoy being in community with all of you. But if there are people who should be sitting here who aren't, I want to know who they are. So please tell me, so that the next time somebody asks me, what I can say is, you know what, I shouldn't do this, I need to make space for somebody else. Can you tell me who that is? It's part of my job to figure out who that is, but it's also part of the community's job to let me know who that is, so that we can be better about doing this stuff. Oftentimes, it's the same people who end up on the same panels because we know each other and we like each other and we know we'll do a good job and we feel a responsibility to each other. But that's not necessarily a good way to continue running conferences. So if anybody is doing IPV work in the context of restorative justice and you think you should be sitting here talking about your experiences, please let me know so that the next time I get an invitation, I can say, not me, but.
And I think that's...
I'm going to say something very quickly.
Okay.
Sorry. Yes, I think young people should be here speaking. It would change the language of the conference, which would change the meanings.
And I think that's a great question to start us on in terms of the kinds of challenges we need to be making to each other, but also the kinds of challenge then we all need to be taking back about where are we creating multiplicity of spaces. So part of what it means to think about being a restorative community is to think about how you govern, how you make choices, how you make spaces, how it is that within those spaces you can create opportunities to hear from all of the voices that are key to our pathway forward. These voices, the voice that you gave us from the back, which is a great gift to us to start us on the right conversation, and looking around the room to see who is here, and looking around the room to see who isn't here, and who we need to make sure is in our conversations as we leave from this place and the next time we gather. So thanks very much.